The Germans' loss of people, resources, and allies led Germany to engage in diplomatic activity and sign the armistice to end World War I. These choices led to the end of the worst war the world had seen at that time. But it took a long and grueling 4 years for Germany to decide to cut their numerous losses. June 28, 1914, Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was in Sarajevo when all of a sudden something that would change the course of history happened. 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, who in many artistic pieces is shown as jumping out of a crowd, shot Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, with a Belgian-made Fabrique Nationale Model 1910 .380 caliber pistol, killing them both. Gavrilo Princip died on April 28, 1918, signifying the end of the man who started the Great War. Tensions were already high between Serbia and Austria-Hungary, but the assassination of the Archduke made it worse. Gavrilo Princip was a Serb, and Austria-Hungary jumped to the conclusion that the Serbian government was responsible for the attack on Franz Ferdinand and his wife. Austria-Hungary declared war on June 28, 1914, starting what would later be known as World War I.
After Austria-Hungary declared war, countries started taking sides. Quickly, two sides formed. The Central Powers, which consisted of Austria-Hungary, Germany, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, was one of the major forces in the war. The other side was the Allied Powers, which consisted of Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Japan, and the United States, and was the other major force in the war. At the beginning of the war, not all of the countries were engaged in it. Bulgaria announced they would enter the war, tearing Europe apart on October 11, 1915. America didn't join the conflict until even later on April 6, 1917, after 3 years of battle and conflict. It took until August 4th for Germany to invade Belgium, after they wouldn't let Germany through to attack the French army and bypass all of the French's fortifications. This was a major victory, and they managed to hold Belgium until the end of the war.
But it would only get worse for Germany. A major battle that happened next was the First Battle of Ypres. The First Battle of Ypres, true to the name, took place in Ypres, Belgium. The battle would yield a huge amount of casualties and would start off the trench warfare found in many battles after. The First Battle of Ypres lasted from the 19th of October, 1914 to the 22nd of November, 1914. After over a month of fighting, casualties numbered in the hundred thousands. The British had about 54,000 casualties, the French had about 50,000 casualties, and Belgium had about 20,000 casualties. However, the one country that trumped them all in losses was Germany, with 130,000 total casualties. The First Battle of Ypres wasn't the only battle that took place there, nor was it the only time that Germany would suffer mass amounts of casualties. There were two more battles, both of which yielded mass amounts of death on both sides of the battlefield. The Second Battle of Ypres only had 35,000 casualties on the German side, an incredibly low number compared to the next battle, the Third Battle of Ypres. The Third Battle of Ypres was also known as the Battle of Passchendaele, and this battle yielded the most casualties. The battle lasted from July 31st, 1917 to the 10th of November, 1917, and over the course of the 102 days that the battle took place on, 260,000 German soldiers died. Only 75,000 British soldiers died, further showing that the Germans had suffered a devastating loss. After the war ended, Germany had sustained a loss of 2 million soldiers. Losing 2 million soldiers was an incredibly big loss, as that number of losses was 15% of its army. Not only that, but Germany had the most losses of any other country in the war, and was even more losses than other countries combined. This was one of the reasons that Germany signed the armistice. Of the Central Powers, Germany was the last of them to sign an armistice. The first of the Central Powers to sign an armistice was Bulgaria, and they signed an armistice on September 29th, 1918. The next Central Power to follow suit was the Ottoman Empire, who signed an armistice on October 30th, 1918, more than a month later. Down to two members, Austria-Hungary couldn't take it anymore, and signed an armistice on November 3rd, 1918, leaving Germany all alone. After just over 2 weeks of being the only Central Power left, Germany decided to sign an armistice on November 11th, 1918, ending the war. Even before their allies signed armistices, the Central Powers was outnumbered by a lot, and countries leaving made it even worse for the remaining countries, such as Germany. Being the only central power left against several other countries who could assist each other with resources, give each other information, and help each other in battle just simply wasn't possible for Germany. This is another big reason why Germany signed the armistice. Resources were also a very big concern for Germany during certain points of the war. In 1916, Germany had a big problem. They didn't have enough fuel. That was a problem because without fuel, they couldn't run trains, and trains were used very frequently to carry materials, soldiers, and weapons across the war front. Not having fuel to run trains was a very big blow to Germany and their ability to transport items. In 1917, the coal resources that they had weren't enough to supply the civilian needs, but they also couldn't supply enough arms. Not being able to supply arms was one of the worst things that could happen to a country, as war revolves around having arms and using them in battle.
Speaking of arms, shells were very important in the war. Shells were metal projectiles filled with explosives. They were frequently used in the war, and the number of shells used in the war numbered in the millions. However, Germany's shell production went down. By 1915, Germany didn't have the resources for shell production, such as cotton,
However,
camphor,
Germany
and
did try
pyrates.
to do something to combat the losses of the resources. What they did to try to combat their losses was called the Hindenburg Program. The Hindenburg Program was a policy started in 1916 by Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff. This policy did many things, but one of the major things it did was related to armaments. The Hindenburg Program produced many weapons and munitions despite the limited resources that Germany had to work with. However, that ended up harming Germany instead. All of the weapons created as a result of the Hindenburg Program had to be transported, and the trains that were used to transport the arms clashed with the trains with food supplies and trains transporting troops, resulting in food shortages, further harming Germany.
Not only that, but Germany's economic collapse during the war made it even harder for Germany to keep going, and made it harder to supply arms and do other vital things that were needed to continue fighting in a war. That is another one of the reasons that Germany signed the armistice. In conclusion, over the 4 years that World War I tore the world apart, Germany lost many battles, and in the process lost 2 million soldiers. They also lost all of their allies in the span of a few months and were the last central power remaining by the time their allies had left them. Also, they didn't have enough resources and materials to give to their people and maintain war efforts. All of those factors combined was the reason why Germany signed the diplomatic attempt known as the armistice to end World War I.